सर्वे भवन्तु सुखिना, सर्वे सन्तु निरामया, सर्वे भद्राणि पश्यन्तु, मा कश्चित् दुःखभाग् भवेत्. This shlok encompasses Indian spirit of harmony when it wishes, may all be happy, may all be free from sickness, may all see good, may none partake suffering.
Good evening, everyone. We welcome you today to the G20 University Connect, Engaging Young Minds, a lecture series in collaboration with the Ministry of External Affairs and Research and Innovation System for Developing Countries at XLRI Jamshedpur. The G20 is an intergovernmental forum comprising 19 countries and the European Union. It was formed in 1999 to shape and strengthen global economic cooperation. India holds the current presidency of the G20 from 1st December 2022 to 30th November 2023.
The G20 University Lecture Series acts as a catalyst for empowering young minds to envision a brighter and more inclusive future. While India celebrates Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, XLRI also celebrates the 75th year, that is, the Platinum Jubilee of its establishment. Being the oldest B school in India, XLRI focuses on nurturing responsible global leaders for a greater common good and a sustainable future.
Today, we are honored by the presence of Shri Sanjay Bhattacharyya. He is a distinguished Indian diplomat with over 35 years of experience. His illustrious career includes multiple diplomatic positions like Secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs, Ambassador to countries like Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Turkey, Egypt, and the Arab League. He completed his schooling from St. Columba's School in New Delhi and pursued economic honors from the prestigious St. Stephen's College, Delhi University. Following his bachelor's, he pursued his master's in economics from Delhi School of Economics. He joined the Indian Foreign Services, IFS, in 1987, where he spearheaded the government's Act East policy, Arab affairs, passport services, and diaspora affairs. He was also the BRICS Sherpa during India's presidency of BRICS and served on the governing council of the Jal Jeevan Mission.
Now, we are honored to welcome to the stage our esteemed guest, Shri Sanjay Bhattacharya ji, to illuminate the ceremonial lamp and mark the beginning of the G20 event. Joining him, we request for this special moment our Director, Father George, our Dean Administration, Father Donald, and our Dean Academics, Professor Sanjay Patro and Professor Kalyan Bhaskar. Please, sir, we request you all to come on stage and light the lamp.
Thank you for lighting the lamp and marking the beginning of our event. I would now like to invite Father George to bestow our esteemed guest with a bouquet. I would like to invite Father Donald to present our guest with the Jubilee Memento Shawl. Thank you, sir. Now I request Dean Sanjay to offer a memento as a token of our appreciation.
Now, I would like to request our director, Father George, to address us with his precious words. Please welcome him with a round of applause.
Shri Sanjay Bhattacharyya, our chief guest of today, and Dr. Rahul Ranjan, chief of RIS, our deans, faculty and students, good evening to you all. It's a great privilege to welcome Shri Sanjay Bhattacharyya to XLRI when we are going to celebrate our Platinum Jubilee of our institute. Shri Sanjay Bhattacharyya is a diplomat, writer, speaker on foreign and security affairs, governance, public policy, India story, policy advisor, former ambassador to Switzerland, Turkey, Egypt, Secretary Minister of External Affairs, and BRICS Sherpa in charge. A multifaceted individual with great achievement, he has come in front of us to share his experience with the young minds of corporate leaders of tomorrow, and I am sure his wisdom and knowledge will enrich you and guide you to move forward with optimism and confidence. Also, welcoming all of you for this event to take part in the nation building exercise in contributing in our corporate service. So thank you very much once again.
Thank you, Father George, for your inspiring words. Moving ahead, let us now watch a video introducing the theme of 2023 Indian Presidency of G20 and all the events and developments it entails within.
India, home to 1.3 billion people, is a confluence of religions, traditions, and customs. A thriving global center of technology and the world's largest democracy. As one of the oldest civilizations in the world with a rich cultural heritage and diversity, and as the fifth largest economy in the world, India is proud to assume the presidency of G20. As the country blooms into a new era, we look to another poignant symbol for humanity to emerge victorious from challenges. The lotus, the national flower of India, represents our history and culture and symbolizes spirituality, fruitfulness, wealth, and knowledge. And that's the inspiration for India's G20 logo design. The design rendered in saffron, white, green and blue is drawn from the national flag of India. The 7 petals in the logo signify the 7 seas and the coming together of 7 continents at G20 India 2023. Sitting above the lotus is a representation of the earth, reflecting India's pro-planet approach to life and seeing the world as one family. From this, we derive the theme for G20 India 2023, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, one earth, one family, one future. A theme that brings the G20's focus on shared global growth, while being in harmony with nature. G20 India 2023. One earth, one family, one future.
Vasudev Kutumbakam, one earth, one family, one future. It is inspiring to see India's commitment to multilateralism and global cooperation in addressing the challenges facing our world.
As we embark upon this G20 University Connect initiative, we graciously welcome Shri Sanjay Bhattacharyya to share his insights and wisdom, drawing from his invaluable experiences. We welcome Sir to please come and bless us with his gracious words. Please welcome him with a huge round of applause.
Namaskar. It's really delightful to be in Jamshedpur. For me, it's after 50 years. I also have another deeper connect with this region because, and this institution in a sense, because I started my schooling in a Jesuit school, and I'm very proud of the fact that I went to Dinobili to start off my education. It stood me in good stead. It's so wonderful to see you all here, the bright young minds of India. You are the ones who will shape the future of India, and I wish you all the best in that. You are in the best place to make the difference that the world needs. Today, before I begin, I wish to first thank Father George, XLRI, the members of the faculty for inviting me here, Professor Bhaskar for being in contact with us and with RIS. The RIS and Ministry of External Affairs have been at the core of this University Connect program to spread the word about the G20 and what India is doing about it. But before we get on to that main subject, I wanted to share with you the world that we live in, because it's so important for us to recognize that this is the era of transformation, of disruptive changes in technology, the way innovation is bringing change in our lives, in the way we work, the way we live, and the way we shape our future. And your role in this is going to be instrumental, because we have to adapt and create this new reality. Fortunately for us, there is a lot of technology that is extremely advantageous to society and to development. It allows countries like us, which are engaged in development, to leapfrog the stages of this process and become more developed at the same time, and perhaps faster. But we also have challenges. We are all aware of the kinds of issues that come up with climate change. We've seen how rainfall has led to floods and landslides, but sometimes it leads to the lack of rain and droughts, how the rivers are shrinking and getting polluted, how the oceans are getting warmer and changing the marine life. There's also other challenges that we face. We have aging in society, terrorism by fundamentalist forces, and we have war in Europe, which has made them extremely conscious of what war can do once again. Though, as we all know, war has happened in our parts of the world for a very long time. But we also see that this is the time when the center of gravity of economic activity and also of technological innovation activity has shifted from the Atlantic, from around the Atlantic towards the Asian continent. And India is at the heart of it with many others. And therefore, this is a particular time of opportunity for all of us to bring about those changes so that we can become more contributing members of the global community and bring about those changes of governance in international institutions that can make the difference. So today's agenda is to discuss the G20, and I thought what I would do is first run through the G20 story, then talk about what G20 does and how India has fashioned the priorities for its presidency, and finally a few words about the role of the youth and how do you all fit into this. If we look at the G20 story, you will realize that this is something that was born out of economic crisis. You're aware that there was an institution of the G7 and of course the G8 as well, which was at the center table, which would take the decisions for financial stability. And for many of the developed world, that is what the important thing was, because they were already prosperous and they wanted to bring about stability so that their prosperity would not be affected. But around the end of the last century, there were a number of crises in finance, the Wall Street crash, the economic downturn in the developed world and the OECD, and they realized that they could not deal with these issues by themselves because the center of gravity of the economic activity, not just in manufacturing, but also in terms of technology and output of new ideas, was shifting more towards Asia. So the G7 members invited a range of other countries, the finance ministers and the central bank governors, so that they could collaborate together for financial stability. And that was the genesis, the beginning of the G20. And this process really happened around 1998-99. In 2008, when the G8 plus outreach summit was taking place in Japan, in Toyako, in the North Hokkaido Island, President Bush approached Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. India was invited to these G8 outreach sessions because of the weight that its economy was beginning to have as an emerging economy. And President Bush told our Prime Minister that there was a thinking that we needed to move towards a summit level interaction for G20. And the reason behind that was that then he would be able to give that kind of direction that was necessary. And later in that year, of course, there was the celebrated Wall Street crash as well. But the first inaugural summit of the G20 was held in Washington, D.C., followed by the first formal summit in London in 2009. This was the first time that the G7 expanded its table to include members of the emerging and developing countries. And what they did was, the G20 that was born was something that comprised roughly about 85% of the global GDP. We were 2/3 of the global population. We were also about 3/4 of the global trade and about 4/5 of the global trade in services. So we were a very large economic content, and the hope was that through this particular mechanism, which included the OECD G7 and emerging countries like India, China, and many others, that we would be able to take decisions because the multilateral system was not always able to do that. and decisions when they were focused primarily again on financial stability issues. But once the G20 became a reality with the emerging countries, we were able to bring to the table some of our priorities. And the first priority that we had was of growth and development. And that became center stone in the G20 process. In addition, there were new ideas coming out about investments and sustainability and how we could tackle with issues of climate change, and also some of the political security issues began to come onto the table. The G20 works essentially through a mechanism of meetings under two broad pillars. The first pillar is the old traditional financial pillar, and it's normally run by the finance ministries as well as the governors of the central banks, in our case the Reserve Bank of India. And the second pillar was that of the Sherpas, who would basically represent the head of state or government, in our case who would represent the Prime Minister, and discuss the overall context, including political and security issues, development, and so on. And this was the broad format in which we would try and reach understanding on areas of differences, on areas of our priorities. We would also then try to make sure that we would be able to bring on new items onto the table. Now, the G20 does not have a permanent secretariat. And since it does not have a permanent secretariat, the presidency assumes a very important role in guiding the course of the G20's agenda. But we have a system of troika, which is the previous presidency as well as the incoming presidency. In this case, we have Indonesia as the previous one and Brazil as the next one. And we collectively then work on the agenda and also the consensus seeking that is necessary. This also allows us to then discuss emerging issues that come up during the course of that period of time. And therefore, the G20 becomes a much more enriching experience. If we move to the main priorities for the G20, when we assumed the presidency last year in Bali from the Indonesian side, you would recall that we were still in the midst of the COVID. There was the war that had broken out in Ukraine. And in a sense, there was this need to resolve these issues of crisis, but also to bring about a sense of hope and optimism. The economic crisis, the recession in the Western world was acting as a dampener, but we needed the agenda to move ahead. So when the broad outline was drawn as to how we should fashion our presidency, the three priorities were: first, we should promise hope to the people. And this was something in which we would provide peace and security and stability, and also address some of the old issues. The second was that there was this need to bring about an understanding of the difference between the developed and the developing countries or the emerging economies. And the Global South, although it had been part of the discussion table for a long time, the voice was not heard well enough. So we brought up this concept, which is of One Earth. You heard in the promo that was played before you, of One Earth, One Family, and One Future. Now, this is very, very Indian in its orientation. This understanding of the global community as one, of the brotherhood of man, and the need that we need to have a holistic approach towards resolving our differences so that we truly have win-win solutions for everybody. And the third thing that was decided was that, in a sense, the way we have been seeking to democratize our own processes, we would take this out to the people. In other words, give not only the people of India the opportunity to understand and feel the G20 and understand what their role would be in the days to come, but also to let the other partners in the G20 feel India's diversity, our sense of plurality, our democracy, and the way development has happened. And also, in a sense, this was the time for showcasing our demography, the youthful dividend that we have. So we saw this as an opportunity as well, in which we could drive the economic agenda for the global community, redefine the priorities, strengthen the cooperative mechanisms, also see how we could highlight some of the achievements that have been obtained in our own system, particularly in the digital world where we built a digital infrastructure, and try and bring a greater commonality amongst the people. Another key item that we thought we should prioritize, and this was an opportunity, was to highlight the sense of the global south and the leadership role that India could play in this particular context. Now, as you're aware that for a very long time, the global south has views that have sometimes been at variance and not always heard, and it was felt that it was needed to coalesce these together. And so the voice of the global south was seen as another major priority that we would bring about. When we were defining the agenda, there were 7 key themes that we wanted to highlight, and I'll run through some of them. The first was on energy transition. Now, we have had this issue about the hydrocarbons being a predominant segment or share of our energy use. We also know that our energy requirements would increase with our development pace, and we would need to bring about a new balance of the energy mix. And therefore, the transition that was required towards more renewables was something that we wished to highlight. This, of course, has been an important element in the climate change discussions as well. What we tried to do, and there were 2 things that we highlighted. The first was the role of renewables, particularly of solar energy. As you probably know, the International Solar Alliance was an international organization that was established at the initiative of India and France, with its headquarters in India. And we made ISA as one of the partners of the G20 process, thereby highlighting the role that solar energy would have in the changing of this energy transition. The second, and this was a big achievement, was on the establishment of the Green Hydrogen Task Force. The decision on this was finally taken at Hiroshima during the G8, the G7 summit that took place over there this summer, and a task force and India has been at the forefront of this, along with key players like Japan and Germany, who have had significant research initiatives in this. This is one of the ways in which we would be able to achieve the transition, and plans are afoot. You are aware that there is a green hydrogen plan that the government has launched, and the details are available, so you can have a look at that as well. The second thing that we did was a concept called life, or lifestyle for environment. You see, what had happened was that the process of development, particularly after the Age of Enlightenment that came out of Europe, the agricultural, industrial revolution, the mercantilism, was one in which we had tremendous advances in technology. So on the other side, the supply side was very well provided, but consumption was often, in a sense, wasteful and often excessive, and often leading to greed and competition, which was of a much higher level, leading to conflicts as well. So the idea was that we should try and bring about a balance between the kind of consumption pattern that we have and the kind of technologies that we develop. And you have, of course, this that comes out in different forms. Today we talk of the circular economy. The idea was that we should embrace some of the past, which is our traditional modes, which were far more holistic and respectful of the nature and environment around us, as well as adopt the modern technologies, which can also provide new solutions for the problems that we have. This LIFE initiative was launched by the Prime Minister and the UN Secretary General right at the beginning of the year, and it's had very significant impact amongst many of the developed countries in the G20. And there is a new understanding that is coming about, so that it meshes in with your SDGs and climate change objectives. The third priority that we said that we need to focus on was what's called bridging the divide. And in this, we wanted to particularly highlight the role of the digital infrastructure that needs to be set up so that the accentuated divide in society in terms of economy or economic opportunities or access would be bridged in a certain sense. We in our country realized that it was important to bring about this digital digital infrastructure to provide an identity to individuals, which would then provide access to various range of services that are required, and that these would be done in an efficient manner. So the identity, of course, as you know, in the digital infrastructure is provided by things like, let us say, Aadhaar or PAN, and the access happens through various services which are now also available in the digital world. So whether it is, say, the passport services that my ministry provides, or let us say the registration of a company, or your holdings of property, and a range of other services that you might need, which are now available in a digital manner, and which is then the transactions are also smoother. But what we've also seen is that many of the economic policies of the government are now being implemented through these digital platforms. For instance, the direct transfer system that we have, which cuts off many layers in between, which increases the transparency of the transaction as well as the efficiency, cuts off leakages that might happen. So we highlighted this aspect, and recently we found that in various other forums as well, for instance in the environmental forum, that this is something that was realized as one of the benefits coming out of the process of G20, and it's now being adopted. For instance, the UPI model, which has been put out as an open platform, is now being adopted by different countries, including in Dubai, Singapore, France, so that we have a broader space in which this digital infrastructure can find its true vocation. The next one that we said, the fourth priority, is an old priority which has come on for a very long time, which is in response to the climate question and the issue of climate finance. Now, to be honest, this is an area in which we have had limited progress. All the agenda items have not been very successful. This is one of those in which we had some problems. And this has been a problem for a fairly long period of time. As you know, the climate change issue is essentially discussed in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And there is a COP process in which the countries come together to negotiate how they will put in their commitments. So there is a broad understanding that there is climate change coming about, and we need to take measures for adaptation and mitigation, and that we need technology and funds which can then be provided to the developing countries in particular, so that they can undertake measures. And because these countries do not have funds, they have to come from the developed countries. And there was in Bali last year an understanding that we would set up a fund of $100 billion annually, which would provide for projects of this nature. Unfortunately, although there was understanding, and this has been happening for a very long time in the climate change issue, is that the funds never really came in the measure that they were expected. Of course, there were other mitigating circumstances like the war, the economic slowdown in parts of the OECD world. But nonetheless, we tried to make efforts so that people would stick to their commitments as far as possible, so that this would come about. But I must say that at the end of the day, this is something on which we need much greater work. And essentially also, what is also necessary is that the developed countries have to own up to the responsibility of the historical baggage that they have created on the climate issue, so that this doesn't become something that affects the entire global community. Because it cannot be done in a segmented country-wise or area-wise manner, because what happens in a far-off place can affect another another place and people who live in a distant neighborhood. And so it is important to coordinate these efforts as we go ahead. The fifth priority was on food security. This had been an old problem. You know, in India we had faced famines in the days gone by, but today that doesn't happen. We are a net exporter of agricultural products today. But once the Ukraine war happened, this was something that again came to the forefront, because Ukraine and Russia, which are two very significant grain exporting countries, could not export their grain, their wheat in particular. And so therefore there was an understanding to sell wheat and other grain under the Black Sea Accord, which has again been stopped. So the question of food security is not one of the total production of food, because as of date the world produces enough food for itself. But it's a question of being able to transfer them to the places or the communities that need them more. In other words, the supply and a logistics constraint. And that happens because of impediments of various forms. It could be natural calamities, it could be war, it could be sometimes restrictions that are trade related. And so we held, India organized a World Food Security Summit, which was at the agriculture ministers level. And at that, they, for the first time in the G20, discussed the broader ramification of both the supply side as well as the demand functions to see what is it that the farmers need. What is the kind of package of subsidies or prices that you would need so that the farmers get adequate remuneration and it remains a profitable venture for them, and also to see that there are no bottlenecks in supplying to countries or communities which actually have a shortage in terms of the production, so the supply can get there. We have had great success in this, I must mention, because this is brought to the forefront in the G20 process, an idea that has been affecting large communities of the global south in particular. You know, in Africa and Asia, there are communities that are deficient in terms of nutrition. Another idea that came out of this, which was again an Indian initiative, was to bring about this idea of millets. And essentially what it did was look at more sustainable cropping patterns and agricultural practices so that we would be able to sustain not just the cycle of food production, but also the environment at the same time. This was, I think, one of the areas in which we are happy with the progress that has come about. The sixth priority was in trying to democratize the financial governance system. As you would understand, this was one of the things that has been there from the days that the G20 idea began. We were, particularly emerging economies like India and China, were asking the IMF and World Bank that we have a greater share of the votes, of the voting rights, so that the decisions regarding the financial transactions that happen out of these international institutions would be more friendly towards the needs of the developing countries. This has been a big struggle, but the World Bank and IMF, as you know, have made leeway. And in fact, even in the UN system, there has been great progress in some of the administrative reforms that have come about. But fundamental change, which is what we had asked for, is still to happen. But in the meanwhile, what has happened is that the global south, or countries within the Asian and African continents, have also set up other lending agencies. For instance, the African Development Bank or the Asian Development Bank. And as you know, there's also a BRICS Bank, which is known as the New Development Bank, which does a similar kind of function. It's not seeking to replace, but if you can have greater South-South cooperation, then we should do it. In this particular presidency year, we were able to have one significant understanding, which was for the highly indebted poor countries, and to have a debt suspension mechanism, because it's been a very difficult year for many countries with the slowdown in the economic conditions globally. And so this debt suspension mechanism, which has been agreed upon, is going to benefit about 49 countries, many of them in Africa and in Asia. And this is one of the highlights of the progress that has been achieved. The seventh one, priority, that was highlighted right at the outset was one about accelerating the SDGs. Now, as you know, the SDGs were multilaterally agreed upon, and each country had its national agenda, which was, and its time plan, which was to be done by 2030. However, because of various reasons, including the COVID pandemic, including the identification issues of the problems, the underlying problems, we are actually short of the targets in many of these cases. And the G20 process did an intensive review of how to identify and focus and prioritize in certain sectors. It was found that some of the areas on which we are falling short are those related to health, education, sustainability. And so it was felt that we should kind of pool our resources and cooperation so that we can have an accelerated front towards addressing some of those issues. So that, because at the end of the day, the real issue is that you do need to make a difference to people. And the SDGs are the parameters on the basis of which we do that. One of the other things that happened in this context, and which was very useful in setting the tone of the discussions, was the Global South Summit, which was organized by India. Prime Minister led it in January of this year. 125 countries participated, and they had discussions under 7 different themes, which are relevant to the sustainability and SDG aspects. And this provided for a range of opinions. This question of democratization that we had been talking about was also brought out in this particular Global South Summit, because we were able to hear the voice and the concerns of many in the global community. And then when we have the G20 sessions, the various ministerials and such, we were then able to address these much more directly. So how do we do this? The idea is that we have an intensive engagement under all the pillars. The Sherpa pillar, which does the big issues of agriculture, the political issues, investment, employment, development, and the finance pillar, which looks at mainly the stability issues, and also the new financing issues that come up, say in relation to health, which has come out of the COVID pandemic situation. And then there is this third segment that has emerged, and which has become much more vibrant in India's presidency, which is the engagement with civil society and with the people at large. And in fact, this is one of those events where we are out with the people so that we can hear your voices, you can understand a little more about the G20 process and how that fits into how the global systems work together. And under this, we have various mechanisms, including the youth engagement, the universities, women in business, parliamentarians, and this provides a broader range so that there is much greater participation, because at the end of the day, we have been convinced that it's only through participation and demanding that change that you can actually bring about the change that you need. In terms of the broader engagement of countries, it's been typical for G20 to invite, the presidency to invite guest countries, and we invited 8 emerging economies. Some of them are very, very close friends of ours and neighbors, but these again bring the greater diversity that is necessary. So for instance, when you have countries like Bangladesh and Egypt, or you have Singapore and United Arab Emirates, then they bring that diversity that is necessary for a more enriching G20 discussion. And that actually now brings me to that last segment of my presentation on G20 as to how does it link up with the youth. And when Prime Minister was launching this particular initiative, he put out in his initial remarks, he put out, and I was able to cull out 5 points which I think are very significant. The first was to look at the issue of tackling the challenges through collaboration rather than conflict. And this is again, this discussion-oriented, bringing and building consensus rather than just fighting it out where the other side has to lose, but both sides cannot win. The second was to re-emphasize the role of technology. And in this again, I think your role would be very central because you are the creators of new technology. And this is the way we can move ahead and reach out to many more people. The third was to highlight the experience of India in building digital public goods and the digital infrastructure that we have created, which has brought so many more people into the process of development. It has led to a sense of empowerment and led to a new level of aspiration amongst them. The fourth was to highlight the role of the Global South, which I talked about. And the fifth was to bring about this understanding with nature, what the old Indian understanding of our relationship with nature, which is a much more harmonious, holistic experience. And this is something that also is reflected in the life model that we had advocated. So finally, I think we are at a stage today where we do need the young people, the youth, to be much more engaged in not only their own empowerment, but to get more engaged and involved in the policy making and implementation stages. We are at a very critical, crucial juncture where, as I described earlier, in this age of transformation, everything is changing so rapidly that we need to be able to adapt ourselves and to create that new environment. And so what is the future of jobs that is going to be? What is the kind of environment that you wish to have? How do you wish AI to play out in your lives? What are the kind of apps that you think that you are comfortable with? Is social media something that is going to be a net gain for the society and community that you live and operate in? How do you deal with cybersecurity issues, the opportunities of data as well as the challenges? So we are in a very exciting phase. I was very delighted to learn that XLRI has been engaged in a number of activities related to G20, because at the end of the day, I think our generation that has worked through the last century and this has created new technologies which are extremely beneficial. But I think we also leave behind a legacy which is also challenging in some ways. Climate change is one of them. The kind of challenges that we have with the data world, the new digital world is one of them. The way we deal with innovations is one of them. So that's for you to tackle. And I think the solutions will be global. So G20 is one of those ways in which we reach out to the global community. And I hope that you will make this world an even better place. Thank you very much.
We are immensely grateful, sir, for gracing us with your profound insights and wisdom. Your words have surely sparked a multitude of questions within our young audience. To pave the path towards quenching their intellectual curiosity, I cordially invite Professor Kalyan Bhaskar to come and moderate the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Simran. Thank you so much, sir, for that very insightful talk. And I think a lot of points that you mentioned are quite pertinent in today's time. And I think you talked about that role for engagement. And I think now the platform is for us, all of us here, to engage with the ambassador on topics he has mentioned. So we are now proceeding ahead with the Q&A session, and this is open to everyone here and those joining us through YouTube. If you have a question, post on YouTube also, we'll try to take those questions. Some rules for this thing. All types of questions are welcome. So questions on the topics he mentioned about G20, questions on what's happening about India and the BRICS summit. So Indian Prime Minister was in South Africa just last week on G20 summit, on BRICS summit. BRICS is expanding, and we are now going to have G20 summit next week in Delhi. And I think this lecture series is perhaps one of the last such lecture series that RIS is perhaps organizing in India. So I think it's coming at a very opportune time, especially as we launch the 75th Jubilee celebration for XLRI. I think there, if you have a question on his life, especially serving in Europe during the Ukraine war time, so what's the sentiment about India in Europe and serving in places like Turkey, which has seen a lot of turmoil, what it is to be a bureaucrat in the IFS service. So all types of questions are welcome, and I think no holds barred, so floor is all yours. The CPPR folks will help you get the mic to you, so go ahead, feel free, any questions? Okay, so what we'll do, we'll perhaps go for 2 or 3 questions at a time, and we'll try to club them and then direct to the ambassador. I think I see a hand up there, and I think I see a hand up there, and over one here. So we'll come to all of you one by one. So maybe if you have the mic, please go ahead. And please introduce yourself as you go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, sir. My name is Ashwin. Thank you so much for your words. It was very interesting to look at what the G20 is doing and aims to do over the presidency. So I just wanted to ask a question. A large part of your presentation focused on India being the voice of the global south, which I think is a very commendable thing. So I wanted to understand how, since the G20 currently has one African nation as the member, and a lot of the other 19 countries have been focusing on Africa due to its immense growth potential, do you see any of the African countries potentially joining the G20 anytime soon? And if so, what kind of impact do you think they can create due to their membership? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that very interesting question, the role of Africa, and people talking about this being the century of Africa. So can we have the second question, please? Over here. Can you pass the mic, I think? Please go ahead.
Good evening, sir. I am Anand from BM Batch. I would like to ask that given the diversity of nations in G20, as each have different socio-economic landscape, how is India trying to foster collaboration and progress toward collective development to SDG goals? Thank you.
So SDG is one on Africa, and let's take one question here. Professor Rahul has a question. Can you pass the mic in the front row? In fact, I forgot to mention, we have, as a surprise, we have kept some goodies for the questions, those who ask the questions. So CPR folks, keep note of the ones asking the questions. You'll be given the goodies during or after the event.
Thank you. Thank you for telling us that. Thank you, Mr. Bhattacharya, for such an insightful talk. So I'm more interested in something which I teach here at XLRI. I teach strategic communication. And India is a part of Global South, right? And we are struggling with the developed nations. Like, the biggest concern for us is that when it comes to the discussions in summits about the climate change, we have to address the needs of climate change. At the same time, we have our own development needs. So how does India actually maintain the balance? And that happens when it comes to trade as well. For instance, we are a society which tries to protect its trade, its agriculture. But when it comes to G20 summit, we have to actually get into their agreements. We have to listen to them, right? So how do we try to get into this balancing act and then maintain our stand as well? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Shukla. So, sir, you have 3 questions, one on the role of Africa, one on SDGs, and one on, again, this developed versus developing country.
Thank you. These are really interesting and excellent questions. I'm so happy you raised the question of Africa, because we really believe that Africa is the continent of the future. Africa is where the greatest amount of growth is going to take place in the days to come. And Africa is largely unrecognized in the global community. And so it was extremely important that we engage with them in a much more deliberate manner. As you know, our bilateral engagement, India's bilateral engagement with Africa is very deep and diverse. We have historical civilizational ties. We host the India-Africa Summit, in which all the members come together, and we have a very, very broad development cooperation agenda with them. But what we did in the context of the G20 is that the G20 was trying to become like a body where you could have some sort of consensus which could then lead on to a decision-making process in the multilateral framework where everyone is actually represented. So Prime Minister this time actually wrote messages to all the heads of delegations of the G20 country members asking for the admission of the African Union as a permanent attendee of the G20. We can see what format it can take. As you know, the G20 already has one organization which is part of the membership, which is the European Union. And the idea is to have African Union come in so that it can have a greater say and we can hear Africa much more. So it's a very important question that you've raised. Recently, when the BRICS was expanded, as you know, we included 6 new countries who will become effective members from next year, and 2 out of those 6 are from Africa. So Ethiopia and Egypt are the new members to BRICS from Africa. In other words, the voice of Africa is heard much more. The second question that, if I may address, is about how do you deal with diversity and SDGs? It is a big challenge, but I think what we did essentially was that for many of these SDGs, the challenge is really in the developing world. And the Summit for Global South, or the Voice of the Global South Summit that was held in January, was extremely useful for us in that context because we were able to identify and highlight what the main problem areas were. You know, things that are going well, those are fine, but there are problem areas which you need to address. And so we prioritize some of those areas which I also mentioned during the presentation. And we're now looking for collaborative mechanisms so that we can have progress on SDGs. And we are hopeful that we would be able to translate some of these into achievables. But the challenge for the SDGs by our target of 2030 is a big one. It is truly a big one. And I think in the world of international diplomacy, we must be sometimes honest enough to recognize that some of these problems are tough. And this is definitely one of them. But I think we are trying to go about it in a systematic manner. The third was about strategic communication and how do we manage this duality, if you wish to put it that way, of what our expectations and aspirations are and what is perceived to be the global voice or the voice of the developed world. Now, let us be very clear that, you know, it is not easy to resist the leverage that developed world has because they often have the levers of finance and technology, and your development is to a large extent dependent upon the kind of collaboration that you can work out with them. But at the same time, there is a two-way traffic as well. And just as you know, the rate of return in the developed world has become much lower, the rate of return in the developing world, or the emerging economies in particular, is much higher. So there is obviously a definite need in the business community, in the OECD, to come out and work in the developing or the emerging economies. So you do have some levers as well. But I think most importantly, it is the kind of conviction that you can carry. And let me put it this way, that there are two kinds of challenges that come about. The first is how you can work out the challenges in terms of the political security domain. And very often those tend to be more difficult to meet because you don't have the countervailing, or you can't offer them something in return. But if you look at the way in which we've dealt with, let us say, the nuclear disarmament and the CTBT issue, taking a very hardcore political security issue, where we refused to have this discriminatory system that persisted and which actually persists, and in order to achieve our goals, we did not sign CTBT. So there are ways in which you can actually stand up, but it's not easy, admittedly. On issues like climate change, I think we've been very much on the discussion table right from the beginning. So if you look at the Rio understanding, where India came out with this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, and that has been at the core of the manner in which we have sought the Global South to address this issue, and the global north or the developed countries to provide with the resources necessary. Because if you look at it, as we proceed on our development path, our needs for energy will increase. Our per capita consumption today is well below the average per capita consumption and way, way below that of the developed world. So we should be allowed that wiggle room to go ahead. But that doesn't mean that we do not assume a responsibility. So when you look at energy transition, for instance, we have said that we shall be carbon neutral by 2070. So we haven't taken on the demand of many of the developed countries that we got to do it by 2050. We need 20 years more because the lives and development path of my people, my citizens, matters more to me. And so we've set 2070. But we have also set very ambitious targets. For instance, we have said that by 2030 we will have 50% renewables in the intensity of our energy mix. We've also said that if you look at the carbon intensity of our industrial production, then we would bring it down to about 45%. So we have taken very ambitious steps, and we are hoping that we would be able to address this issue through renewables in a much more deliberate manner. You mentioned about trade. Now this has been a big, big challenge because the WTO, I didn't mention much about it, but the WTO, which has been an outstanding organization for bringing about rules for global trade, has actually had very lukewarm success in recent years. And the reason for this has been that the perceived need of the developed world to protect their markets against the new emerging markets, because in many cases we are way more efficient, definitely cheaper than the modes of production that they employ. And so they have set up barriers in many, many forms, which has been a matter of great discussion. And today the DSB in the WTO, the dispute settlement body in the WTO, has literally collapsed because some of the principal players are not partners in the WTO DSP process anymore. So this has led to a new set of arrangements that work out. For instance, the plurilateral arrangements for free trade that many countries have done, including India. So you have bilateral arrangements, you have plurilateral arrangements for freer trade, and that's the way ahead, which will happen. The WTO, of course, had this mechanism for RTAs or regional trade agreements, which was provided. But that will be the course of things till there is greater understanding. Because it is tough for many countries to cede power. And the power that has shifted from across the Atlantic towards the Asian continent, South and East Asia, is a reality. So the changes that need to be brought about in a new set of rules. And then, of course, there is this new industry that's coming about, new modes of services that are coming about, and they will need new rules as well. For instance, whether it is data or it is in terms of the new production methods that are being done and how we deal with them, digital trade. So we are in a challenging world, and I think we will have this ambiguous play for some time. That is, there will be a weak multilateralism, but a greater recognition of the multipolar world in which we are all strong economic entities.
Thank you so much for those detailed responses. I hope these addressed. Before we take the next question, I would just like to put an anecdote to the first question on Africa. I think PU came out with a research yesterday which talked about how is India perceived by the world, and I think some of the highest favorable ratings were in African countries like Nigeria, countries like Kenya. I think the need for India to engage with the African, I think just re-emphasizes. So just to take the next set of 3 questions, CPPR folks, can you help pass on the mics?
Hello.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah. Good evening, sir. I'm Anjali Sodhani from the BM program. I just wanted to know what are the best practices and learnings that you have experienced while implementing the life movement, like lifestyle for environment, in creating a climate conscious society and making the people pro-planet.
Okay. Yeah, other countries. Yeah. Thank you for that question on Mission Life. Can we have the next question?
Hello, sir. Shubham here from the BM batch. So sir, I wanted to ask, as you told that in green financing we have a target of $100 billion, but we get it on paper, but we are not able to realize it on ground. So what are we doing different under our presidency to realize that that we are getting all those finances on ground as well? And I had second question. We talk about climate change and infrastructure as well, but we haven't touched on the topic of climate disaster management. So is that a part of our G20 goal, or how are we tackling it? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's have one from the right side so that we not be accused of favoring the left.
Yeah.
We are
Hello,
as much
sir.
to the right.
Yeah, so I'm Sohan from the BM batch. I want to ask that currently we are facing lots of conflicts in the world, right? So there is the Ukraine conflict, there is the US-China conflict. So in this situation, how far do you think India can maintain its stand of neutrality? Because India is coming forth in the world
How much
stage.
India can be neutral when you have so many wars in the world? Russia is here. Interesting. Thank you so much for those questions. So first one on mission life, the second on climate finance and climate infrastructure disaster, and the third one on India's neutrality. I think three, I think we'll go ahead with it. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. India has adopted a policy which is one of strategic autonomy. So we've progressed from the days when we were non-aligned to one which is now talking of strategic autonomy. I think it's important to understand this concept, and you can read it up because it's very important in understanding how we deal with things. So if you look at, for instance, our position on, let us say, various wars, etc., we do not think it is necessary to have to support one side or the other which may be there, because you can have your own perspective. And it is often not understood that, say, for instance, on the Ukraine war, it is not that we are pro this or anti that. We are something which is our own position, and it's very clearly elucidated. We say that you cannot have a situation where you use conflict as a way of resolving differences that there are. And you do need the process of negotiations and diplomacy to resolve these differences. In the Middle Ages, or whenever people would go out with their armies and their battle swords and fight wars, but have we not progressed as human beings since then? Should we not have an aspiration to do that? And I think in the Ukraine situation, we have not been able to give full play to the role of diplomacy and negotiations. So we've asked for both sides to stop their conflict. And there were instances in the early days when we were actually in contact and conversation with both sides, where we could have actually moved into negotiations. So it is important to know that it's not that we are neutral. We have a strong view on all these issues, but it may not coincide with the view of the so-called Western world or the other side that is happening, because we can have our own perspective as well. The second set of questions was about climate change again, and as I very honestly admitted, and in diplomacy sometimes it's good to be honest and transparent. Climate change is an issue on which we aren't making progress. So we had this decision in Bali, but we haven't got the funds. And what can you do? You can't really force it out of their pockets, but you have to kind of tell them different kinds of logic. What diplomacy does is to provide a range of options so that something will work, and something which at the end of the day leaves both sides on the negotiating table with something to go back happy about. And unless you do that, you will not have a tangible solution. And climate change is one of those, because if you look at the way the progression has been, the kind of emissions that come out from, let us say, the United States or Australia or Canada or many of the European countries, they're way, way ahead of what India does. But the imposition of standards and the imposition of requirements and of cut in the emissions is always imposed on the developing world. They have their needs too. So, I think till such time that this consciousness is not deeper, and we'll keep trying at it. You know, this is the way, you have to be patient, you have to be optimistic in negotiations, and you will then come to some kind of an understanding. But we haven't reached there yet. So today we have some commitments out of that 100 billion which have been realized, and understand that that was meant to be an annual contribution. On the on the climate disaster management, you know, this is a very key issue now. I didn't mention, but along with the ISA, the International Solar Alliance, which has been made a partner in the G20 process during our presidency, there's also the CDRI, or the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, if I got it right, which has also become a partner in the G20. We've realized that climate change has led to traumatic situations because of the unpredictable nature of occurrences on the climate front, and also the intensity with which they come, and the time at which they come, which is often not in accordance with the usual understanding of seasons. So we had built up earlier what is called humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. So that was the broad framework in which we would collaborate with many other partners, so that once a disaster happened, then you would come to their assistance. And India has been a first responder in many, many cases, including in very far off places like Turkey, where we were there very soon after the earthquake took place. But CDRI is for building an infrastructure which is more disaster resilient. In other words, you built up parameters which will be responsive to, say, earthquakes, or cyclones, or if you have tsunamis, how do you deal with them? And so that's become very central now. And CDRI, which is, and again, an international body headquartered in India, has now become a partner of that. And the first question was on
Mission Life.
Oh, yes. You know, in the 60s, Japan had, when Japan had just started growing, its climate condition was, its pollution levels were very, very high. And if you look at pictures of Tokyo or Yokohama from the 60s, you will think they are like Delhi today. But they've been able to transform it. They had a very high level of social commitment towards those objectives, so that you can build an economy in which waste is frowned upon, and if you have waste, that is recycled in a responsible manner. So the movement that you see towards the circular economy is one of the ways ahead. I was in Switzerland on my last assignment, and that's another very beautiful country where everything looks green and the sky is always blue. And how did they do it? It's because they've put a very high level of value on preserving their environment. So if you look at, of course, Switzerland is not part of the European Union, but if you look at the European Union's agriculture policy, we have a policy of subsidies which provides MSP, for instance, which provides fertilizer subsidy, which provides energy subsidy. What the European Union did was what they call a green box approach, which is they provide area support, which is aimed at protecting the environmental conditions of an area or the cultural heritage of an area. And that brings that sense of pride in making sure that your environment remains something that you would be proud of. And that is the manner in which we should also go ahead. And I think that process has yet to begin. We have been bringing about, thank you so much, Father. We have been able to bring about a greater sense of cultural consciousness through various movements. There are conservation movements which bring back the pride of our past. But we also have to make sure that we don't get embedded in that, but we also have the future. So what LIFE does, for instance, the LIFE movement which I mentioned about, is to blend that tradition with an acceptance and adoption of the future and technology.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for those insightful takes on those questions. So now can we have the next set of three questions. I think now this time maybe one from the left, two from the right.
Yeah, so good evening, sir. I'm a second year student of the business management program, and I'm also one of the students taking the public policy and business strategy elective. So my question is based on the fact that we've seen India's stature as a soft power grow in the past decade or so. It was especially evident in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, with both parties looking up to India to be part of the negotiations. So I wanted to ask if you could give us your thoughts on what are the reasons behind this increase in stature and what it bodes for the Indian businesses going forward.
Soft power. Thank you. So can we have someone now on this side?
Hello sir, my name is Pankaj and I have a question for you. Given India's commitment to Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, how does the nation envision having a peaceful coexistence and maintaining relationships with its hostile neighbors? Also, I would like to know what strategies is it proposing in the G20 summit regarding maintaining the regional stability in South Asia.
South Asia, hostile neighbors, and regional stability. The question. Yeah. So with hostile neighbors, how do we maintain peaceful coexistence? And the first one was India's soft power going up. What are the factors? And I think, can we have one from the front? I think we don't see as many enthusiastic response in class when we go for class participation. So.
Hello sir, my name is Yash. So sir, the guiding principle of India's foreign policy since our inception as a modern nation state has been the long stated goal of strategic autonomy, as you mentioned earlier as well. So how do you see the grouping like BRICS or Quad for that matter compromise or enhance that very idea? Because we are seeking to collaborate in these organization or groupings, but in order to collaborate we need to compromise on our interest as well. So in your opinion, do they enhance our objective of strategic autonomy or compromise that?
Excellent question.
Thank you. I think another round of very, very insightful questions. Strategic autonomy is not what we started with. It is where we are today. Because over the years, over the decades since independence, we have overcome many of our challenges. And today, India is a large economy. We are a very fast-growing economy. We have a very strong democracy. And as I said, the demographic dividend is also in our favor. Now, what that does is it increases our capacity to engage with the rest of the world. And the way we wish to do it is through strategic autonomy. So, I mean, I'm trying to put the context in which strategic autonomy evolved. So even in the past, we were non-aligned. So we were not with either the Soviet bloc or the American bloc during the Cold War, but we followed our own independent line. But it was a more benign process as compared to strategic autonomy, because today our capacity to deliver and our willingness to take action has increased. And those are two very important components. So as part of this engagement with the world, and we also recognize that the globalization process that has happened has been very, very rapid. So supply chains, value chains are all now interlinked, and we have to be part of them. We also realize that this is the era in which ideas amount for much. So while manufacturing is very important, the intellectual content that goes into manufacturing or the logistics of that is equally, if not more important. So globalization has also become very critical. The other factor that has also happened, and I mentioned about how multilateralism has in a sense flagged. It has not really been able to provide to its true potential. And there is a weakness in the multilateral system. There's a flux, and we need to fix that system. So reforms are necessary, but the current existing power holders are unwilling to give up their powers or share their powers, which is necessary for this reform. So we are moving into the multipolar system, which is a little different, in which a multipolar system is one in which the emerging economies have now acquired significant weight, and they can actually do many things on their own. They don't need the blessings, so to say, of the greater powers of the past. And in fact, many of the new emerging economies are now bigger than some of the powers of the past. So in this, there is of course the understanding that the UN and the multilateral system that it represents is still at the core, and I think they have done outstanding work after the Second World War. But they are still rooted in the conditions of the previous century. They haven't been able to reflect the changes that have come about. And that is the reason why many of these new plurilateral bodies have come up. Now, India is in this unique position where it has the ability to straddle both streams of ideology, so to say. So on the one hand, we have partnerships within our region, whether it is SAARC, which has not made very great progress because of Pakistan, or BIMSTEC, which is with the extended ASEAN region, which is continuing to do very great work, or the IORA, which is in the Indian Ocean Regional Association, where we have great collaboration, even on new areas like the blue economy. And then we have even other political understandings, like the East Asia Summit, which is ASEAN +6, includes countries like India, China, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, Australia, and it has, the partnership of the US and Russia. We are also in SCO, which is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was, started as a grouping which was led by the Chinese and the Russians. We also have, we are active partners with China and Russia in a trilateral framework, which is known as the RIC, Russia, India, China. And on the other hand, if you look across, and I am truly convinced that, the future of the world is really moving towards what is the new Indo-Pacific paradigm. And I've been working on that as well. The Indo-Pacific paradigm provides us, as the Japanese Prime Minister Abe had said, the confluence of the seas, of the economies and potential of the Pacific with a new potential around the Indian Ocean. And it's a free system. It's one in which we are looking for independent initiatives. One of the initiatives which have come up as part of the emerging Indo-Pacific is the Quad, which had initially started more as a security mechanism, but as you are now aware, there are working groups which work on a range of development-related ideas. We ourselves have advanced an idea to extend the Indo-Pacific towards what's known as SAGAR, which is secure and assured growth for all in the region, which actually leads the Indo-Pacific all the way towards the African continent, which is also to respond to the question that was raised earlier, because we do feel that Africa is the continent of the future, and therefore we need to kind of work on that as well. So I think there have been great initiatives in which we've been all part of, and it's the way that emerging powers will have to play as they balance their capacities, their growing capacities, with growing willingness to engage in the global community. This issue of peaceful coexistence, the situation in South Asia, is extremely important for us, because there's nothing more important than what is happening in your neighborhood. And in our neighborhood, we've actually been rather blessed, because we have a series of development initiatives which have yielded positive returns. So for instance, if you look at the SDG outcomes of countries like Sri Lanka or even of Bangladesh, they both have had very significant growth as well as achievement of SDGs. Of course, if you look at Bhutan, it has the highest, one of the highest happiness index. But there are issues as well within our region, and I think if you look at our neighbor Pakistan in particular, we see serious issues within that country, as well as the relationship that we have with it. The trouble is that if the agency of non-state actors and of fundamentalism becomes part of the mainstream state activity of a country, then it is extremely difficult to negotiate when terrorism is part of the agenda of the other country. And I suspect that this will continue to be a problem, and I don't think we should harbor any illusions that this is likely to go away very soon. So we have to be very mindful of those very serious impacts, because in a sense they have an impact on the unity and integrity of our country, of our nation as well. But in the broad landscape in South Asia, and in the broader extension of what we now call the Look East, which has become the Act East, which takes us into the ASEAN and into the Pacific, and what we have with our engagement with the West, our immediate neighborhood in the West. Because as you grow, your concept of neighborhood also expands. So earlier the neighborhood was your geographical neighbors, and today your neighborhood is extended to what we call an extended neighborhood, which includes countries with whom you have much deeper cultural connections, trade, economic connections, and so the Gulf and the Arab world, parts of Africa are part of that extended neighborhood as well. And I think the scenario is much, much brighter and warmer. The first question that came up was about India's stature, and I can say very, with great pleasure and pride that the times have changed from the time that I joined the government as a diplomat 36 years ago to the situation that is here today. At that point of time, we were a struggling economy, and the kind of weight that we had in international fora was based essentially on what was seen as our adherence to values and principles. But values and principles are very important, but you need to back them up with the ability to deliver on the economic front. And I think that is what has essentially changed. Because while we've been able to keep on those values and principles, because we were very active participants with the degrowth, we have technological growth, and people look at us as possible partners in the economic realm as well. And I think that's brought about this change. The other thing that has brought about the stature of India, as you put it, is one in which our engagement with the rest of the global south, the developing countries, the development assistance that we provide them is not based on our priorities, but on their development priorities. And it is very important to recognize this, because certain other countries that we are aware of have not had that approach, because they have, as they would say, foisted projects on the developing world, which are not necessarily feasible or practical or remunerative and do not provide the rate of returns, and have turned into bad debts, or which have led to huge debt accumulation within those countries. So we have not followed that. And for a very long period of time, a number of countries in the global south in particular had this notion that the teacher and the doctor had come from India. That was the experience of the Indian diaspora. And therefore it was always a positive feeling that they had about India. So today we are able to complement that with the possibilities of economic cooperation. So if you look at the data of FDI coming into India, that is very significant. But more importantly, look at the contribution of Indian corporate investments overseas. And also, of course, the investments that we put in into development projects. But look at the share of corporate investments going into countries overseas, which has been growing steadily, and that gives us that greater currency, which makes India a more desirable partner.
Thank you, sir. We have a question from a guest on YouTube. The question is, what's your view on India's BRICS membership, which is seen as an opposing part to the West as opposed to India's position in G20? And how should India balance its relationship with West and South, particularly China and Russia? So this is a question from Akitav Tiwari. And just an add-on from me, perhaps. So Shekhar Gupta, the prominent journalist, he made a comment in the Cut Letter video just this week that India is being second fiddle to China by towing Chinese lines in BRICS. And India should get away from BRICS and focus on other institutions, other alliances. So what's your take on this question?
Not because I was BRICS Sherpa during our presidency of BRICS 2 years ago, but because I really believe it. I think we should understand BRICS in the proper context. So BRICS is firstly a 21st century institution, unlike many of the others which were born in the 20th century. And so in some ways, the BRICS grouping reflected some of the realities of the 21st century, as well as the dynamism and aspiration of the 21st century. So the two key pillars that BRICS really pursued was firstly to bring about growth and development within the BRICS countries and be able to extend it to the rest of the global south, because in a sense, the BRICS members, the BRICS countries were large, fast-growing economies, but were also representative of the countries around in their region. The second broad priority that BRICS had was to bring about change in global governance, because the large multilateral system had actually failed to provide the level of aspiration that many of the developing countries had. So in that context, BRICS has always been growing. BRICS had started with 4 members, and South Africa was added very soon after we had our first summit. We set up the BRICS Bank, the New Development Bank, and in the BRICS New Development Bank, there was, and I think this might be an interesting thing for all of you, initially the suggestion from China was that China would put an overwhelming share of the capital of the New Development Bank. But within the BRICS, there was consensus that there must be equal capital amongst the 5 original members, and that's what was agreed upon, so that the rights are equally shared. And that's the kind of idea that we had for the World Bank and the IMF as well, that it should reflect our growing share in the global economy. When BRICS began to take part in the projects, the BRICS Bank, the bulk of the projects were actually not in BRICS countries but outside. So we felt that there was a need to expand the BRICS Bank because there was great desire on the part of many aspirants, and we derived a set of criteria by which 4 countries were to be admitted. Bangladesh, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates have already joined, and Uruguay is going through the process of becoming a member of the NDB. So in other words, the BRICS has been an expanding organization, and that is in response to the dynamics of the 21st century organization that it is. Now the changes that have happened today, and I've seen there's a lot of comment, and I think in some of the literature and some of the comment out in the media, you will see this dialogue going on that is BRICS going to be an anti-Western bloc. Now, can you imagine an expanded BRICS with Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates being an anti-Western bloc? India being pro or West, pro or anti any group, India will be for India. So I think many of these are based on certain vested interests that try to promote them. And it's not just the Western media. I think there have been media from some of the BRICS member countries as well, which tried to suggest that the weight of such countries has been expanding, and they need to be representative of the global south, and therefore they need to take on more members. So I think the BRICS is often misunderstood, and I think to some extent the level of dissemination of information that we've had about it has probably not been enough or adequate. But today I think it is important to recognize that BRICS is an economic entity which is more representative. The new members that have come up are all very, very friendly towards India. In fact, 3 of them are strategic partners of India. So you can imagine that this is something that was done on the basis of consensus, and it must reflect the dynamic. Now, does BRICS affect? Some people say G7 actually, because today with the new BRICS that has come about, the share of GDP that the BRICS commands is a little beyond what the G7 has. So is it like a counter to G7? And I think in this world today, there will be many, many groupings that will try to preserve the past, that will try to change the past, that will try to bring about a new world order. But I don't think there has to be necessarily a confrontational attitude. And if you look at what Prime Minister had said, that you have to face challenges through collaboration rather than conflict. And I think confrontation is just one stage short of conflict. So I don't see BRICS as being opposed to G7. In fact, in G20, the BRICS grouping, which is a very significant group in the G20 as well, we are a very united voice. And I think in many of the dynamics of the G20 outcomes, we have supported each other in bringing greater consensus, not just amongst the Global South, but also with the OECD members.
Thank you so much, sir. And I think it's a testament to your thoughts, your opinions, and the way you have engaged all of us, that all of us listening to you with rapt attention. And we are well beyond the scheduled close of this event, but still we want this to go on long, but I think I'm just keeping a tab on the clock also. So I think what we'll do is we'll take last set of 3 questions, and then we'll sort of maybe have this conversation go on after the event. So do we have someone who is from outside the XLRI who would want to ask the question? So I think, so we have someone from outside the XLRI, so can you pass the mic to him, please? Please introduce yourself, sir.
Good evening, sir. Actually, this is Debanjan Kosh. I'm alumni of XL. My question is that, first of all, Mr. Bhattacharya, thanks a lot. You have full of energy. For last, I think it's 2 hours, no energy drop, and you are literally giving very good speech and lots of insights. Thanks for that. Thanks, Mr. Professor Bhaskar, also for calling and other stuffs. My question is, sir, is like that. See, G20 is a big thing, and India is currently hosting it. So, how young Indians, people present here, can contribute here? And since you are working with many countries, so many challenges are there. What are some of the learnings, if you can share with us, that will really help us?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Debanjan. Can we have one from the left, one from the right? And others who have their questions, if you can stay back after the event, we'll take the questions.
Hi, good evening, sir. This is Ashutosh. So my question is related to South Asia. South Asia happens to be one of the most, least economically integrated regions in the world. So can India's improved stature and integration with the global supply chains improve the bilateral trade and economic integration in South Asia?
South Asia. So South Asia is the least economically integrated region. So, South Asia. And can we have one from the left?
Hello, good evening, sir. So my father is also watching this event live on YouTube. So this is a question from him. How has India's participation in the G20 forum influenced its foreign policy priorities and economic strategies? And what role does the country play in shaping global economic governance through its engagement in the G20? And so one more question from my side. I was wondering, since the theme for this year's G20 is Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, which means the world is a family, and considering what is happening in Russia, Ukraine, the war, India hasn't invited Ukraine as a guest to this event. And in my opinion, since India shares a very good relationship with Russia, this event could have been a good platform to mediate and bring some. The economy of the world is suffering a lot due to this war, and India could have played a good role by inviting Ukraine, I believe. So what's your take on that?
So thank you, Mr. Obedient Son, for asking that question. So good. So these questions, very interesting points, sir. If you can have a quick take on these questions.
Sure. Let me run through them very quickly if I can. First one was about how can people contribute to the G20? I think we need to understand that the world is evolving in many ways. G20 is a forum that evolved so that we can take certain consensus or understandings which emerge within these major economies which contribute to 85% of the world's GDP and 3/4 of trade and so on, to the multilateral fora, because at the end of the day, I think you do need consensus or agreements at the multilateral level, which has become very weak. So G20 becomes an instrument in that. And our understanding has been that the reason why the multilateral fora has become weak is because it has not adopted this basic principle of democracy, that, every voice must count, and, you must take cognizance of their demands and their requirements. And so we've, in our presidency, tried to bring about that sense of democracy and for greater participation. So whether it is, in terms of having all these different sectoral meetings and having a detailed understanding of these, the Global South Summit that we hosted, these engagements that we are having right now where we come out to the people to hear your voice, these are all very, very significant towards an understanding of what the global situation is and how we can all participate and become elements of that. And we actually must believe that the way, and somebody had also talked about the growing stature of India, that this is the stature and power of the people, which is the stature of India. It's not that India is something different from the stature of the individuals or the citizens of India. And so we have to understand that we actually can play a role, and it will not happen till we actually demand it, as I had said. So in today's world, you have to demand change, and then it will happen. If you look at the experience of many other countries, the political systems are very, very different. So we don't necessarily have to subscribe to all of them. But the economic systems that many of the countries have followed, in which a sense of discipline has come about, a sense of efficiency has been built up, a sense of connection with the global in the global world of globalization. If you look at the way in which China has developed over the last 4 decades, it's been truly phenomenal. And I think we must take many lessons from it. It's not that we must become like China. I'm not saying that at all, because we must grow up in our own way. But there must be certain things from the Chinese experience of how they integrated into the global economy, how they were able to build up on scale, how they were able to push their export so that the demand which was deficient in the domestic market was met by the global market. So there are many lessons that we need to do. I mean, that's just one example. If I look at my last country of working, which was in Switzerland, their striving for excellence is another example that we need to adopt. I would go to small little towns and villages in Switzerland, and they would say that they were very well known for making, this weighing scale, and that weighing scale is the most precise weighing scale that is used in every big lab across the world. So they would say that I built the best weighing scale. Or if you look at the watch, or if you look at various other products, in the world of innovation. So excellence is something that we really need to do. And when you go for excellence, you also have to be competitive. And it is not sufficient to be competitive in your domestic environment. You have to be competitive globally. This thing about South Asia and supply chain, if you look at the trade flows between the developing world, and this is despite the fact that we have actually built and signed several FTAs amongst ourselves, continues to be a much smaller fraction of global trade and our own trade as well. So the intra-developing countries trade, or intra-South trade, if you put it that way, is still a very small fraction. If you look at the European Union, in contrast, their intra-EU trade is a huge fraction of their overall trade. So we have rather smaller autarkic economies with protectionist walls, and we don't trade enough with each other. That has to change, and the only way that can change is if we can become part of the global supply chains. That can happen not simply by being part of the manufacturing process, because then it will just be assembling, but also becoming part of the intellectual process that goes about, and also the logistics chain. So, I think it's a much deeper thing that we have to do it. The question that came from the father about how G20 has influenced our foreign policy and shaped our economy. I think as I had said in one of those slides, we took upon this G20 presidency experience. It comes once in 20 years, so to say, and we all do it by turn. So how do we make that as an opportunity? And I think what it did was we were able to leverage various domestic developments onto a larger international platform. So we were very fortunate that over the course of the decades, India had been growing steadily. Today we are the 5th largest and so on. There is a great attraction for investments in India. We need to make the ease of business conditions even better. So these are various lessons that we learned, but we were also able to leverage so that we would be able to align our economy with some of the global developments that are taking place, so that we would become part of the emerging scenario. So it's not just a question of looking at the past, but also looking at the future. In terms of foreign policy, I think the most significant shifts that have happened, or I wouldn't say shifts, but I think the nuances that are important to realize, because shift is a very loaded word in the foreign policy context. Some of the nuances that came about was that I think in some ways the growing India was able to assert its foreign policy in more clear and explicit terms. The second one was that I think the independent stance that had been evolving over some time, over the last 2 decades or so of strategic autonomy was articulated much better, and I think G20 was a good platform for that. And I think the third one, which perhaps is something that has much greater orientation towards the future, is that this concept of Global South has now gained much greater currency. And I think there is some discussion about the so-called issue of leadership of Global South. But I think that is not the most important question. The important question is that the Global South recognizes that the world is moving in a multipolar direction, and that the Global South is becoming important poles in that. In other words, they are in a position to assert their interests much more actively. On the Russia-Ukraine issue, I think I would say that the G20 has had great success across sectors. On virtually every area, we've had progress, primarily those that lead to growth and development, stability, taking care of the interests of the Global South. But I think there have been 2 reasonably difficult issues on which we haven't made sufficient progress. The first I mentioned about climate change, so I don't need to elaborate on that. The other one is really this issue of what is happening in Ukraine. And I think there are narratives that come out from either side which tend to often dominate the media space. But we as professionals understand that the situation over there is a little more complex than the black and white kind of scenarios that are often portrayed in the media, and often also by the intellectual community. And in this, the very shades of gray that are there, it is, I think our position I've already articulated. We've had a very strong position on how we go ahead on the question of Ukraine. Last time when the summit was being held, there was the possibility that they would not have an understanding on the declaration on the question of Ukraine. And it was at that point of time the intervention of certain countries from the south, particularly from India, which diffused the situation and brought about that consensus. And that thing about this is not the time for war was one that was understood and accepted and led to the final document. We have had similar issues this time as well. As you know, the foreign ministers meeting basically prepares for the summit, and when the foreign ministers meeting was held, we were unable to actually finalize a joint document. And therefore, we had to come out with a chair's statement. And that had come about largely because of the question of Ukraine. And I think because of the fact that there are many grays in that, it is not necessary, for the Ukraine issue to come up. This question of invitation is something that is being forced by one side, and I don't think India is in the business of taking sides. We have had a very principled position, and I think that will continue to be articulated. There have been wars in our region which have been ignored by many others, by many other powers. We have not ignored the Ukraine war. We have actively spoken with both the sides. We have been mediating to see if solutions can be found. But I don't think there should be any illusion that the invitation of one side would actually lead to a resolution, or that it would subscribe only to the views of one side. So I think India's position as something that is not neutral, but with a very strong principled position on issues such as this, and there have been wars in the past as well, is something that is brought out very clearly. I expect that they will find agreement on the broad issue of this particular subject. I still remain optimistic about it.
Thank you so much, sir. And I think it would have addressed your question. So before we move to the next segment on giving prizes to the winners of the essay competition, one question from me, which perhaps you can answer later after the event also. So in one of the social media talks, I heard a diplomat is an honest person sent outside the country to lie for the country. So a take on that, maybe perhaps after this session, so we can have a take on that. So I think on that note, let us now proceed to the prize distributions.
But I think on this I must say a word before we move to the next section, if I may, but very briefly. I think it must be recognized that every diplomat actually serves national interest. But a diplomat also has to find solutions. The job of any negotiator, which is what a diplomat is, every diplomat is essentially a negotiator, is to find solutions. And we find solutions by creating options. So to say that, has to lie abroad is perhaps extending that analogy a little far. So I as a diplomat, as someone who's been a practicing diplomat for close over 3 decades, close to 4, have not had the necessity to have to do that. I think there is a measure of confidentiality that is retained in a lot of the conversation and negotiation, but you always have to be true to the constitution or whatever is your national interest.
Thank you so much, sir. Sibyl, Shubham.
Hello. Thank you, sir, and thank you, audience, for an interactive session. I now extend invitation on the stage to the accomplished winners of the G20 essay writing competition. There are 3 individuals from each of the 6 themes.
To our distinguished chief guest, I humbly request to present the winners with their awards. The first theme was Green Development, Climate Finance and Life. The first award goes to Ria Maria. Second winner, Adish Goda. Third winner, Rahul Meena. Second theme, accelerated, inclusive and resilient growth. First winner, Shivani Singh. Second winner, Vaibhav Gupta. Third winner, Abhishek Kumar Singh. Third theme, accelerating progress on SDGs. First winner, Shubham Singh. Second winner, Arpit Panda. Third winner, Ayushman Roy. Fourth theme, technological transformation and digital public infrastructure. First winner, Shivansh. Second winner, Priyanshu Rai. Third winner, Khanak Sharma. Fifth theme, multilateral institutions for the 21st century. First winner, Navneet Rai. Second winner, Soumyajit Sahu. Third winner, Prajwal Janakinth Haritz. Sixth theme, women-led development. First winner, Krishna Kanuparthi. Second winner, Ankit Guleria. Third winner, Richa Bhatia. A hearty congratulations to all the winners. Now, as the event is moving towards the end, we would like to invite Dean Sanjay Patro to please come share his concluding thoughts with us.
Ambassadors Sanjay Bhattacharyya, Director Father George, Father Donald, our Dean Administration, Kalyan, my esteemed colleagues, dear students, the team of Committee for Public Policy and Research. I think for the first time in 26 years I saw the talk being for half an hour and QA continuing for more than 90 minutes. That shows a lot of interest in our students to know more about the India's strategic role, the challenges that it faces, and how to navigate navigate our industry as well as the nation. Most of our talks get confined to business related topics. So I think you got a vent to raise several issues in this forum. You know, we talked about G20, but there were, as our ambassador mentioned, there are at the civil society level, student level, women level, at business level. There was B20 as well. Though it was confined to the industrialists or the chieftains of the corporate sector of these 20 countries, more than the industrialists from 50 nations participated in that, and most of the focus of this B20 was on digital transformation and artificial intelligence. That's one theme. The second was the global supply chain, and which Ambassador mentioned. The third was about the future of energy mix. You know, these three are very important topics for each one of you, and these are the opportunities where there would be more business-related challenges, innovations. And coming to, the committee, year-long, last year, I think the same time, India became the president of G20 at the Bali conference. It got handed over from Indonesia, and this month, the chief of the nations of the 20 nations will be here in Delhi from 7th to 10th. They have recommended in 9 different areas. They have recommended 54. There were 54 recommendations, 171 action points. See, any conference will have these kind of recommendations. But the point is, they do not want to leave there it as an academic exercise. They have gone for setting up a new institute, B20 Global Institute, which would be set up in India. That will offer, that will be the torchbearer, that will be the think tank, that will be the thought leader for coming out with several solutions. And I think there, many of you will see opportunities. You can go to the B20 site and see what are the emerging opportunities. And we gave yoga to the world, but in the recent days, if you see the global headlines, another product is grabbing the attention of the world. That is UPI. UPI being accepted as the payment gateway in several countries. Recently, France adopted it. Several thousands, lakhs of tourists go to France, and France, the French government is delighted to accept UPI. The point is the Indian customers, Indian tourists, who are really, the average spend by Indian tourists is very high. In the click of your Google Pay or Phone Pay or Bharat Pay, they will be able to do the transactions when they visit the Museum Paris. So with these, thank you, Ambassador, the research collaborator from the Ministry of External Affairs, Dr. Ranjan, and for joining with us this evening and sharing, your insights gained over 35 years. And I wish you have these kind of questions in all our sessions. With these, I conclude my thought. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your inspiring words. Now, we would like to invite Father Donald for a vote of thanks. Please put your hands together.
Mr. Sanjay Bhattacharyya, the guest speaker of this evening, Father S. George, the director, Professor Sanjay Patra and Professor Kalyan Bhaskar, Dr. Rahul Ranjan, and all present here, good evening. It makes me humble to stand before you and present a vote of thanks. The group of 20 plays an important role in shaping and strengthening global architecture and governance on all major international economic issues. We have seen in the past, G20 has delivered in many ways, be it in ensuring microeconomic stability, rationalizing international taxation, and relieving debt burden on countries, etc. In XLRI's commitment to grooming the students to be global leaders, this event has served a tool to engage young minds in contributing towards global governance. In the wake of the G20 summit, the presence of Shri Sanjay Bhattacharyya at XLRI and his critical, scientific, thought-provoking and inspiring lecture has definitely enriched young minds present here. Thank you, sir, for giving your precious time to us this evening and sharing with us your experience, and also for being an inspiration to all of us. We would like to thank Dr. Rahul Ranjan, representing the Ministry of External Affairs, for research wing, for facilitating this event with Mr. Bhattacharya. On behalf of XL family, I would like to thank Father S. George, the Director of XLRI, for his blessings and taking the initiative of organizing G20 University Connect lecture series at XLRI. I would like to thank Professors Sanjay Patra, Dean Academics, and Professor Kalyan Bhaskar and his student team for their meticulous planning and execution of the event with a short notice. Thanks to Simran and Shubham for hosting the event so beautifully. I would like to thank and appreciate all the students who participated in the essay competition in support of G20 Summit. Congratulations to all the winners. Sincere thanks to all the guest participants, the media representatives, faculty, staff and students for your active participation. Special thanks to all those who took part in question and answer session. Too many hands were up. It was really encouraging to see such a overwhelming response. Last but not the least, my appreciation and thanks to all the staff who came together quickly and gave their best in giving every kind of logistic support to make this event a great success. Before I end my vote of thanks, I would like to pray for the good health of Mr. Sanjay Bhattacharya, and on behalf of XLRI family, I wish him all the very best for his commitment and service to the nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for your precious words. Now our representative from the Committee of Public Policy and Research, Ms. Kanika, will deliver the vote of thanks.
I'll make it really quick, trust me. On behalf of the entire student fraternity at XLRI and the Committee for Public Policy Research, I am honored to express our deepest gratitude for gracing us with your presence today. Your insights have cast a guiding light on the path of our academic journey, igniting aspirations and broadening horizons. Thank you for imparting the wisdom that transcends the classroom and for nurturing our enthusiasm for a brighter future. Thank you.
Thank you, Kanika. We will now sing our national anthem, requesting everyone to please stand for the same.
जनगण मन अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड़ उत्कल गंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जलधि तरंगा तव शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभ आशीष मांगे गाहे तव जय गाथा जन गण मंगलदायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे
Thank you everyone for your enthusiastic participation. Please treat yourself with the snacks stationed outside Tata Auditorium. Thank you guests.